Thank you very much to the organizers. I got a call a couple of months ago and really excited to be here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our story as an organization and some of the work that we've done around civic engagement, specifically around getting newcomer and racialized women, women of color, whatever term you prefer to use, connected to the community. But also, as I was telling Henrik, it's also a really interesting political time. I got this lovely invite quite a while ago, but I was saying to Henrik, depending on who won the election, completely different talk around what I could say or not say, or even around the recording. And it's another reason why I don't travel a lot with PowerPoint, so you can just kind of speak to the issues. So Newcomer Women's Services Toronto, we've been around for over 30 years. We're just over at Pape and Danforth. We're tucked away next to the Shoppers Drug Mart. If it wasn't for the shoppers, nobody would ever find us, but we kind of like it that way. The organization, I'm really proud of our history. It was actually started by Latin American refugee women who came to Toronto from Chile in the early 80s, around 1983. And they built up, they connected with local community groups, activists such as yourself, with trade unions, churches, and gradually expanded and sort of grew to encompass everybody. So we have a daycare, we have an English as a second language school, we do some public policy stuff, a little bit of everything, but primarily we're a service provider. And it's sort of a little bit about that story and how it connects to civic engagement that I wanted to talk to you about today. Very informal, feel free to interrupt me or ask questions at any time. Again, sometimes when you're so in your own world, I just assume everybody sits around and looks at immigration statistics and does work around gender-based violence. Like, yeah, why not, right? So really interested also to hear your feedback. I'm going to show you a quick video that some of our activists put together, and because we're so low tech and I'm always so terrified around what's going to go wrong, I brought some of our annual our paper materials because I don't even trust what we have. So talking about community engagement, our governments, policymakers, civil society, we talk a lot about community engagement. So for us, one of the very first questions we have to ask ourselves, what does community engagement look like when we have 80 women from 27 different countries speaking more than 27 different languages in our space? We have about 200 women on site every day. And we've been asked to do community engagement sometimes around really challenging issues. So, for example, one of the stories I'm going to present to you today is we were asked to get newcomer seniors talking about elder abuse. And when we first got that call, I thought to myself, you want us getting grandmothers talking about how their own adult children are possibly hitting them, emotionally abusing them, taking their money, or possibly even experiencing sexual abuse. Talk about taboo on top of taboo on top of taboo. And yet, as we know, especially as our local communities, our demographics are shifting, we have many recent arrivals, newcomers who are coming to the city of Toronto. There's also been some really interesting changes to the immigration laws in the last couple of years. At one point, we were seeing regulatory changes, one to two changes a week, not a month, not a year, 1 to 2 immigration policy changes a week. None of it was going through Parliament. It was a very active file. And they were making changes. For example, some of you may have heard that refugees, people who come here as refugees would no longer access medical care for the first 3 months. You may have heard things in the paper around the government was working very hard to ban women wearing the niqab, taking their citizenship oath. When it comes to seniors, a few changes were made in the sense that seniors, when they immigrate to Canada, are now much more dependent on their adult children. They're not able to work, they're not able to access health care, and it just creates a very precarious situation where seniors who have PhDs and run businesses and have entire livelihoods back home are coming to Toronto and basically ending up doing full-time caregiving for their grandchildren. So we were asked again to break this taboo and get local newcomer women, aunties as we like to call them, in a lot of many of our cultures back home. We have a lot of respect for elders, but we knew that they weren't necessarily experiencing that here. We also had to deal with language barriers and really get seniors to feel like that they had a safe space to talk about some of these issues. So what we did is, rather than pulling together groups of women and say to them, are you abused? Are you experiencing violence? We wanted to create a space where they could create their own leadership space, name their own issues, and identify how they actually wanted to talk about elder abuse. So I'll kind of leave it there. We had 15 women work with some young people to put together this video, write the script, and they actually did it in a number of different languages. So I'm quickly going to show you the short clip, and then I'll dive back in.
We are isolated.
We are suffering.
Nos llaman inservibles.
我们被冷落，
We don't have work or money.
我们被忽视。
Wala na rin kasoy kahakim na. We are confused.
We want to be independent. Мы хотим терпения и понимания к нам.
We want love.
我们要善待自己。
我们还是一个把方面的上不会。
We want to be respected by younger generation.
We want free public transit for elders.
We want to prevent elders from being abused.
It is time to talk about respect.
It's time to talk about patience.
Sevgi konuşma zamanı geldi. It's time to teach our youth to respect the elderly.
要支持老人。
अब वक्त आ गया बुजुर्गों का आलमी दिन मनाएं.
It's time to talk about our feelings.
We are starting a conversation.
We are starting a conversation.
Konuşmaya başlıyoruz.
We are starting a conversation.
It's time to teach our Did I? Oh my god.
Nice.
Very well done. Thank you.
Stop it.
Oh, yeah. God knows what's going to come up next, right?
Yep. Random.
So yeah, that gives you a sense of one of our projects. we know it's really challenging to talk about these difficult issues, but we also wanted to make sure that we very much tapped into the skills of our community members. And you saw that in our Council of Elders, we had women who had been journalists for many years, who had run hospitals. Jingbo was an urban planner who designed half of Beijing. And yet that label, the imposition of who she is as a newcomer woman here in Canada, is really, really problematic. So we really wanted to showcase their skills, but also to give them an opportunity to have a little bit of fun with it, which is also why, you don't really think of bloopers in an elder abuse public service announcement. So when we're looking at issues of data, more and more we're seeing that public policies that we're being asked to respond to or that are being handed down to us in terms of migration, it's not necessarily evidence-driven, it's very reactive public policy. So case in point, we've worked for many, many years with Women's College Hospital and University of Toronto to look at refugee health issues. There's a number of really, really great organizations in the city, like FCJ House and the Red Cross. But then a couple of months ago, all of a sudden, as some of you might be aware, refugee issues came back in the news. For you, what was the turning point where all of a sudden refugee issues became?
It's
Yeah. And so what's your sense of the numbers of people fleeing conflict versus that particular picture, that image of the one child?
Well, there are 8 million displaced people in Syria alone, and it's not a new issue at all, but that's when it got picked up in newspapers and on the news, so.
One of the things that isn't public, and that's why it's really interesting to hear from those of you who actually are working in open data, one of the few accurate sources of information we had around refugees coming to Toronto was actually Pearson Airport. And when the Red Cross gives out winter coats, because everybody who comes in is processed and they get a kit, because we knew that the stats that we were getting, A, weren't accurate, and B, they were very much confusing, who's privately sponsored versus who's government assisted. Even when we were trying to get stats and information from the UNHCR, at one point the International Organization of Migration was actually working with the state to essentially assist with deportations. Many of our newcomers, our community members, were actually being given an incentive to leave. So the whole national policy around refugees and how refugees were seen was very, very negative. And what we were dealing with as an organization, so here, as I told you, our history started by Latino women fleeing the dictatorship in Chile, but there was a real chill around any newcomer organization being able to do any kind of civic engagement. We had to pick very, very safe topics, i.e. don't beat your grandmother. And I'm saying that being crass on purpose because to, for example, talk about Syria or to talk about conflict or to actively talk about why refugees were coming here, access to healthcare, became very, very political. So in terms of information, when it came to open data, we would actually have to rely on the numbers that we were getting from the airport. Also, many settlement organizations, and you may have heard this on the news, we're not actually one of them, but there are specific organizations that specialize in working with refugee newcomers. They've had their budget slashed by a fair amount, and so many organizations had to adapt, right? Many organizations changed their name. Many stopped focusing on newcomers and changed their name to sort of encompass everybody and anybody, which has its arguments as well, but there's also an argument that newcomers have very specific needs. The other thing we started to see is, again, rather than evidence-based policy making, policies were very reactive around, for example, what was in the news. So once that picture broke, and then community members started organizing. Many of you may have participated in the demonstrations. There was a huge sit-in just here at Yonge and Queen. The next thing we knew, within 48 hours, there was a complete turnaround. There was a complete about-face in not only refugee policy, but also how newcomer organizations were dealing with the government. So we had to respond to that at a time where we actually have a mandate where we can speak to current issues or political issues. We've now seen potentially another shift over the last 48 hours with what happened in Paris. So we don't know what's going to happen. As of Thursday and Friday, the organizations that we work with federally that have very high-level meetings in Ottawa, there were 25,000 people going to be airlifted here by end of December. And we were all in planning mode. Everything down from healthcare to toothbrushes to winter coats. Now we'll have to wait and see. So it's really interesting, sort of trying to fulfill a social need, trying to work with community members around engagement when how things are politicized may shift almost on a day-to-day basis. Before I move on, were there any questions or comments, or feel free to jump in?
You were saying that you guys are not specifically dealing with resettlement. What would your role be with those people that are potentially slated to be coming by the end of the year?
Yeah, we actually don't specialize specifically in refugee resettlement. So who we're working with are, so for example, the newcomer leaders that you saw in the video, those are women who may have been sponsored, like family sponsorship. And I think the major difference, without going into all kinds of boring government categories, is they came here by choice. Refugees did not. Yeah, they are fleeing war. So the kinds of issues, the kinds of needs, everything, for example, if something happened in the next 5 minutes and you had to leave the country, do you have your passport on you? Do you have all your papers? Most likely not, right? So dealing with those kinds of issues, we're actually not set up for that. So we, for example, teach English, we have the daycare, but very, very different kind of settlement needs.
And so would that mean that you would be not involved with something between now and Christmas?
Oh, no, we
just
are.
not
We're
involved?
working with a lot of the groups who are privately sponsoring newcomers, and so, for example, we're getting them connected to doctors and housing and things like that. It's interesting, though, because it's the first time we're actually working. So I'm finding you an apartment, but I've never met you. So it's a bit of a different kind of work, whereas usually the whole family comes in and sits down, and we're figuring it out together, right? You have all your papers. You've known for the last 9 months or for the last year and a half that you're moving to Canada. Very, very different kind of conversation, as opposed to the UN camps are in different countries, but for example, we're working with families here who have relatives who are in camps in Turkey or Jordan.
Go ahead.
This might be what you're about to talk about, but I'm interested in hearing more about that sort of evidence-based policy making and the kind of data that would be helpful to you in your work.
Just a comment that I'm disturbed by the fact that the Conservative government had apparently an active campaign to have a chill on immigration and civic engagement. I mean, I'm aware of the climate change chill, that they worked so hard at because it was in the news, but when it's two, it starts to be more of a pattern. I find it quite disturbing. It's not a question, it's just a comment. I'm deeply disturbed by that.
Yeah, quite a few organizations lost funding.
Yeah.
Kairos, larger organizations like Oxfam, rather than actually losing funding, they became targets of being audited by the Canada Revenue Agency.
Because, civic engagement is a basic part of democracy. Full stop. And when our government puts a chill on it, they're, in fact, undermining the basis of democracy. It's bad. It's a bad thing. Sorry.
Well, we were the only Western democracy who has ever targeted Oxfam for anything, and I think their status was suspended for 6 months because they weren't going to stop looking until they found an accounting error, and so maybe accounting software is the answer to your question. But yeah, it's crazy. I mean, there are no in Canada. There are very few bogus registered charities. So
when David Suzuki has to step down from his own foundation, and like,
Listen, we don't have all that much time left. I'm going to suggest that you get back to Gabe's question because we are, after all, a tech support organization, and maybe that might lead to something, if I may.
I'll quickly wrap it up because I have a few more minutes, but I did actually want to speak to the data piece. So I think part of one of the reasons why I was really excited about coming here today is also getting a sense from folks such as yourself around what are some of the other data sets we can access. So when the long-form census was canceled, that was a huge blow. It has since been reinstated. So all of us policy nerds are really excited. For us, to give you an example, so we connect 300 women to jobs a year, and many of those women, for a variety of reasons, are really interested in entrepreneurship. So one of the things that we were really struggling with is we couldn't get any information past 2006 around the kind of information that we were looking for. So the next thing we knew for this study, we were lucky enough to get money, but then we started doing enormous data purchases through StatsCan around looking at tax filer data and the household survey, which, as you might be familiar, it's not as good as the census. For us, though, it's also about the kinds of questions that people are asking. So not only is it the data, but it's also sort of the lens. So to give you an example, there's been a lot of interest in recent years that entrepreneurship is a really good many organizations, the UN, the International Labor Organization, they're actually pushing newcomers to go into entrepreneurship as sort of a structural response to poverty or as a long-term solution to unemployment. But what we were really hearing from our newcomers was that a lot of times entrepreneurship wasn't necessarily the best solution. It was because they were getting laid off or they were working 2 or 3 part-time jobs to make ends meet. And so starting your own business isn't really the kind of success story or Canadian dream story that sometimes it's presented. So we were really interested in asking some hard questions around whether or not entrepreneurship was really, really good for newcomers. And some of the things that we found, and I won't bore you with, or maybe this would fascinate you, I have no idea, but again, this is where your feedback is important. But we were also very much interested in the breakdown by gender. But at the end of the day, if entrepreneurship is a really clear solution for long-term poverty, we need to start looking at some basic things like how much money people are actually making. So, sorry, should have had this prepped and ready to go. Yeah.
And maybe which areas?
So this is for anyone within the City of Toronto. The City of Toronto boundaries, so this isn't including the 905. This is entirely 416. But as you can very much see, the top graph, or the turquoise graph, both for newcomers and non-newcomers, many people who are entrepreneurs, so this is based on the tax filer data, they're actually making less than $10,000 a year. Would you be able to live in the city on less than $10,000 a year? No. So this kind of information is really difficult for community agencies to access. Again, we were very lucky. One of our community partners, Social Planning Toronto, had an in at StatsCan and literally sweet-talked them. They've had so many cuts that it takes them about 9 months now even to do a data purchase. So the fact that we got this in 6 and it's already, as you can see, woefully out of date was huge. So I think part of it for us, other than any sort of public government policy report or anything that an academic is putting out, it's really hard for us as nonprofits to actually get the information that we need to create really good programs or to create really good services. It also means that people like you, and I'm hoping people like us, are asking tough questions that governments aren't necessarily always asking. So again, it's even more important that I think in terms of the open data. So Gabe, does this get at some of what?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I think I'm out of time, so I'll wrap it up there. But just to sort of give you a sense, 2 quick stories, one around civic engagement and the second around sort of where we're at as a nonprofit and just the importance of data. But I'd be very interested in hearing your feedback. I sent around just a quick little brochure that talks about some of our programs, and would be really interested in hearing any of your thoughts or opportunities to collaborate in the future. So thank you. Thank you for letting me run.
Very interesting.